Welcome and thank you for joining us on the 2020 webinar, What's the Forecast for Arts Education? I'm Sherilyn Seeley, Program Manager for Grantmakers in the Arts. Please direct your attention to the poll at the left of your screen. We're interested in your thoughts. Your responses will be anonymously posted. As a result of COVID-19, students and families have pivoted to work packets, online learning, and virtual convenings. This has proven to be a very difficult transition for many. For teaching artists and arts funders in particular, there are outstanding questions around how to handle contracts, manage intellectual property, and how to ensure all students have access to high-quality arts education. We're glad to have Alex Nock, Principal at Penn Group, Kimberly Olsen, Executive Director of New York City Arts and Education Roundtable, and Bahia Ramos, Director of Arts for Wallace Foundation. They'll share the current status of federal funding toward education, share their experience during this pivot, and their lessons learned for moving forward into this new normal. Alex Nock is the principal at Penn Group, where he brings 25 years of experience in federal education, disability, labor, and health policy to Penn Group. At Penn Group, Nock manages an array of clients and helps them to identify and secure their policy goals with Congress, the administration, and congressional and presidential campaigns. Kimberly Olsen is the Executive Director of the New York City Arts and Education Roundtable. As the organization's first Executive Director, Olsen works with a large network of New York City-based cultural organizations and arts educators to provide professional development, share resources, create community-led learning spaces, and advocate for arts education in schools and communities. Bahia Ramos joined the Wallace Foundation in 2018 as Director of Arts. She leads the team responsible for the strategy and implementation of the Foundation's work in areas including building audiences for the arts and promoting arts education for young people. We're glad to have them joining us today. At the very end of the presentation, I will be joining to facilitate a Q&A. With that, I will turn it over to our presenters. Welcome, Alex, Kimberly, and Bahia. Alex, why don't we get us started?
Hey, thanks. So this is Alex. Good afternoon, everybody. Pleased to be with you here today on this important webinar. There's a lot of really interesting things happening here in Washington, D.C. I actually live in Washington, D.C. proper, around COVID-19 funding relief. And, well, I guess you could say there's also a lot of interesting things not happening here in Washington, D.C., but we hope for some activity soon. I first wanted to start with a little bit of an overview over where we've been and kind of how we got to where we got. Obviously, everyone knows where we are with the COVID-19 virus, the coronavirus, but Congress has taken a number of steps to address funding needs out there across a wide array of areas. Not just education-related areas, but testing and economic issues and things like that. So, I'm going to give an overview of kind of where we are on that. So first, probably the thing that you might have heard of that's gotten some pretty wide public attention is something called the CARES Act. That was Congress's first really big bill to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. There was a smaller bill that passed before that started off some of the aid, but this is the one that really reached across a lot of different areas of our society. And it was signed into law at the end of March. It was bipartisanly passed, signed into law by President Trump. It was the first bill that provided sizable education assistance for both K-12 and higher ed. There was something in that bill called the Education Stabilization Fund, which is kind of what it sounds like. It essentially was designed to provide resources to help stabilize school districts and schools and state educational agencies and their operations. And it provided $13.5 billion for K-12 education. There was also similar money for higher education. And that really created the kind of foundation for where the CARES Act provided, or where the COVID-19 bills provided relief for education in general. So as the months kind of wore on in the pandemic, it was clear that schools were going to need some additional resources. The House, in the middle of May, passed something called the House Heroes Act, and that provided significantly more than the CARES Act for K-12 education. Now, mind you, I just said the House passed it, so it did not become law yet. You've had a series of other proposals that have since come out that have tried to influence this conversation one way or the other up to this current point. At the end of June, beginning of July, you had the Senate Democrats come out and propose the Coronavirus Child Care and Education Relief Act, or CSARA, as some people refer to it here in D.C. This bill proposed really what is the high water mark right now for K-12 education. It proposed $175 billion for K-12 education, plus $33 billion for governors, which can support certainly K-12 and early childhood programs, as well as $11 billion for Title I of ESEA in additional supplemental funding, even outside of the $175 billion. The $175 billion too is allocated through a very similar process. It would be allocated through a very similar process as the money went through the Education Stabilization Funds in the CARES Act. Senate Republicans, though, also proposed their own measure with respect to this about a month later, at the end of July, where they proposed $70 billion for K-12. So I think it's important to note that you certainly have the Senate Democrats proposing, close to almost $200 billion for aid to K-12 schools. The House HEROES Act proposing around 60. The Senate Republicans, though, remarkably, now about, I would say, about 2 months later, proposing even more than the House Democrats did in their House-passed HEROES Act. So clearly everyone is recognizing that additional resources need to go to K-12 schools, and K-12 schools are in need of these resources. Part of the fight also has been around kind of what stipulations exist on this money and how they influence different actions for schools. So one of the big hangups in the debate right now, you may have seen that just 2 Fridays ago, I believe it was, that talks broke down between congressional and Democratic leaders and the White House, namely White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows and Treasury Secretary Mnuchin were the lead negotiators for the Trump administration. And they couldn't come to an agreement on a number of issues, some really, really big picture, as in whether or not state and local fiscal relief is going to be provided from the federal government to help state and local governments who are not getting the same revenue from income tax and other taxing mechanisms, to issues of whether or not there should be liability protections out there for schools and businesses and nonprofits if individuals that visits or consumers of those entities get sick, or if individuals who work there get sick. But one of the big hangups too was an issue around whether or not any of the resources provided for K-12 education should be conditioned on schools physically reopening. The GOP bill, the Senate GOP bill, the Safely Back to School and Back to Work Act, proposed that 2/3 of public K-12 money be tied in some way to whether or not schools are physically open. If you were virtually open, i.e. not physically open at all, you were only going to get 1/3 of your money. If you were in some form of hybrid learning or open for a longer period of time or more of the week, you would have gotten an additional share of your resources up to your full allocation. So that was pretty controversial, something very sought after by the White House, as well as some in the Senate GOP, and was a major sticking point in negotiations. We're actually hearing right now a little bit of breaking news that there may be some rethinking going on in the Senate GOP as to whether or not keeping reopening kind of contingencies, I guess, or requirements on any aid that gets allocated through this process or through the negotiations as we go on through August and September here, not be tied to reopening of schools, simply because a lot of schools have already made decisions with respect to that. So the jury's still out on where this goes, but I would expect Senate and House leaders to get pretty serious about trying to reach agreement on this probably in the first early weeks of September and look for something probably to pass by the end of September at this point. Some other really important pieces of COVID relief that are just important to think about in terms of how it impacts both artists that are not employees technically, but just the arts world in general. So a really kind of historic addition that hasn't gotten as much, I think, attention out there is in the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which was that bill I was mentioning that happened before the CARES Act. There was essentially the ability to respond to the unemployment needs of what we call gig workers, right? Essentially, those individuals who are generally compensated through 1099s and aren't actual employees typically are not eligible for state-based unemployment. You have to be employed and then be laid off or be fired to get unemployment. The CARES Act expanded the ability to provide these individuals through the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, essentially unemployment benefits. And this is something that's been sought after for individuals who are not actual employees but are 1099ers for quite some time. There, as the gig economy continues to expand, or whatever you call the economy in its current state, but before the pandemic continued to expand, whether it be individual artists working, for different individuals on an ad hoc basis or what have you, this is a pretty important policy that was enacted here. This assistance is currently scheduled to run out by the end of the year. I think there'll be a very robust conversation going forward about how unemployment systems support individuals when they're quote-unquote unemployed or not getting the same amount of work that they were getting, even though they're not physically a legal employee of an entity. So again, hasn't received as much attention in some circles, but I do think that's something that's going to get quite a bit of attention towards the end of the year. Secondarily, the Paycheck Protection Program. This is money that was accessible to both small business and nonprofits to maintain their payroll. Most people have probably heard about it. It's currently in a state of not operation or in a pause because its authority ran out. I would expect the next deal to continue the authority for this program. And then lastly, the charitable contribution tax deduction. The CARES Act again gave taxpayers an above-the-line deduction, so there's no need to itemize, of up to $300 in charitable deductions starting in 2020. This, I think, was an important recognition by Congress that many nonprofits weren't going to be able to get the same benefit of contributions because of the economy and where people sat without some additional incentive. As you might know, the tax bill that was led by President Trump and the Congress back a couple years ago severely curtailed the ability of most individuals to itemize by raising the standard deduction, and this was a concern by certain members of Congress that would lead to less charitable benefits. So this is essentially trying to recognize or provide an additional incentive to have people give to charities as in tax year 2020. There will also be a very robust conversation, I'm sure, going on about whether to continue that into the next tax year. So I think just some big takeaways here. The timing of the upcoming COVID package, I don't think we're going to see it until September at the earliest, probably late September. I do think when the next COVID package passes, there'll be education funding. One example here would be certainly that individual schools that get it could provide arts instruction to students in different ways, whether it be remote or using different online apps. There will be an updated Paycheck Protection Program. If there are partners out there that haven't accessed this program that need it, it may be a good time to remind them of the availability of this funding. And then lastly, this universal income benefit through the Pandemic Unemployment Program is a pretty historic achievement. That's something that will be a very important topic of conversation post-pandemic. And then just real briefly, if we weren't focused on the COVID bill, we would be focused on what I call regular appropriations for fiscal year 2021. The House has passed its FY 2021 appropriations bill for the fiscal year that starts in October. it included, first there was, funding for the NEA and the NEH at $170 million each, a small increase. And then the Labor HHS Education Appropriations Bill, which obviously funds the Department of Education, included money for the Department of Education, a pretty modest increase there, but it also included a pretty decent increase of $254 million for Title I at the SCA, which is one of the bigger pots of money that goes out to school districts that they can use for different purposes, including arts education-related resources. There's no movement on the Senate front as of yet, and we only expect, or we do expect FY 2021 appropriations to be wrapped up post-election. What Congress will do is pass a continuing resolution to keep the government funding so it doesn't go into a period of shutdown, probably through early December. And then how the election turns out will largely dictate who decides and what they decide works with funding. So just some takeaways on this: modest funding increases this year. Next year could have more promise, though, as there won't be the same budget caps in place that have allowed the appropriations process for the last couple of years. And I think with that, I turn it over to Kimberly.
Great. Thanks so much, Alex. And hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, and a special thank you to Grant Makers in the Arts for hosting today's conversation. My name is Kimberly Olsen, and I come to you today as the Executive Director of the New York City Arts and Education Roundtable. Outside of this role, I've also worked as a teaching artist in over 50 schools across New York City, and I also hold a teaching certification within New York State for childhood and special education. As Sherilyn said earlier, the New York City Arts and Education Roundtable is a grassroots service organization. We serve thousands of teaching artists, cultural workers, and administrators each year through our professional development workshops, our advocacy, by sharing resources, in addition to hosting the largest in-person, usually, arts education conference in New York State. Our main mission really is to improve and advance the state of arts education in New York City, and we build our efforts around the value that arts education should be a right for all New York City students. I'm going to talk today from a local perspective about the challenges and successes our arts education community is experiencing due to the COVID-19 crisis, and I'll also offer suggestions on ways to support the field during this unprecedented time. So in New York City, like many other parts of the country, arts education is built on a partnership between three entities. We have our arts teachers. Those are the in-school certified teachers who work with, in collaboration with, and oftentimes get support from our cultural institutions. These organizations often fill the gap in arts instruction for schools lacking formal arts teachers or formal arts programs. They also serve to complement and enrich sequential arts learning, helping students receive a quality education. In addition to that, they also provide professional development opportunities to educators as well. Now, these cultural organizations employ teaching artists. Teaching artists are professional artists who work in schools and communities. They bring their artistry into the classroom to engage a wide range of people in learning experiences in and through the arts. So for example, when I worked full-time as a teaching artist, not only would I produce performances with my students, but use the arts and theater in particular for conflict resolution, skills building, to learn about social emotional learning, to grow confidence, and to increase English language proficiency. So these three pillars of our arts education infrastructure work together to make sequential arts learning available in every neighborhood across all 5 boroughs in New York City. I'll highlight that 84% of schools partner with at least one cultural organization. This translates in New York City to over 310 organizations, large and small, that partner with schools to bring arts education to 1.1 million students across our over 1,600 plus public schools. I'll compare this number with the number of theater teachers, and while I note that there is a slight uptick in terms of the number of music and visual arts teachers, that number is fairly low considering the amount of students they're serving, and is comparable for dance teachers as well. All three entities are essential to a quality and equitable education, and all bring with them a level of professionalism. Now, with that in mind, COVID-19 pandemic has had a devastating impact on the arts and culture and education system at large here in New York City. In April 2020, our city announced a draft budget that saw tremendous cuts to arts education funding that would not only jeopardize the city's recovery process, but limit both school and cultural organization capacity to serve and engage young people, while disproportionately impacting these nonprofit cultural organizations, as well as BIPOC students and students from low-income communities. As a result, we here at the Roundtable launched an advocacy campaign called Arts Are Essential. We built up a coalition of teachers, teaching artists, cultural workers, artists, students, and reached all the way up to the original Broadway cast of Hamilton, all with the goal of preserving arts education funding and investing in our communities. While we were able to maintain and preserve a piece of that funding, devastating budget cuts were really felt disproportionately on arts education, impacting cultural organizations, their ability to serve students, and also trickling down to teaching artists. So the 6 major areas of impact we're seeing right now on cultural organizations are those cuts to city funding. We're seeing that 70% of funds towards arts and education services has been lost. That's money for contracts between schools and cultural organizations. We're also seeing extreme delays in payments, resulting in cash flow issues from the Department of Education and other city agencies to cultural organizations, some being 12 plus months in advance. Organizations are left waiting for payment. We're also seeing furloughs and layoffs happening in disproportionate numbers to the education sector. We know this from Americans for the Arts, their recent impact survey that they released, noting that education and visitor services tended to be among the most impacted, as well as the more racially diverse categories of the workforce. As we now enter the school year with this decreased capacity on the cultural organization staff side, our field is also lacking clear guidelines. Currently in New York City, we have no system-wide guidance on how cultural organizations can work with schools. Instead, we're finding there are 1,600 individual plans that come with the over 1,600 public schools in New York City. With all this in mind, it has meant that organizations must be flexible and that their flexibility means survival. The same survey I mentioned earlier noted that 11% of organizations in New York City did not think they would survive the crisis, and organizations have been nimble to create original programming and new ways of delivering services, all at this decreased capacity. However, with all of these negative impacts, I will say that our field is one that seeks new opportunities and really seeks to create magic in whatever setting we're in. We're finding that technology has brought a new level of access and new tools and methods to bring to the work, in addition to enabling cultural organizations to partner with schools outside of our geographic region. And we're really seeing an increased interest from communities outside of New York who are interested in partnering with cultural organizations, large and small. Now, all of this impacts the teaching artists, of course, who are employed by these cultural organizations. Before the pandemic, we knew that teaching artists were a population at risk. Over the past several decades, teaching artistry has grown from a side gig to a full-on profession. Yet teaching artists are hired as part-time workers or independent contractors and are often paid by the hour or length of service. They also lack those traditional benefits like health care, pension, and sick leave, as well as do not have that same security of tenure as their in-school certified counterparts do. Now, as I said earlier, that same Americans for the Arts survey, they partnered here in New York City with the Department of Cultural Affairs, and we were able to see that teaching artists were laid off at higher rates, with there being a 78% decrease in artist staffing at New York City-based arts education organizations. I'll note this is as of May 8th and has impacted 2,100 artists. We at the Roundtable estimate that the impact since that date is actually much greater. Another impact and side effect has been on contracts and digital contact, as well as payment rate. We are hearing from teaching artists that they are reporting delayed or lost payment, which is likely a result of the cash flow issue that many cultural organizations are facing. As we now enter the next school year, there's also uncertainty about fair wages for digital content, teaching artists are creating these virtual videos that now can live on, and how are they being fairly compensated for the planning and work that goes into creating those resources for students. With all this in mind, teaching artists have little to no job security and are uncertain about how and if they can continue in this profession. We are at risk, unfortunately, of losing a substantial piece of our highly specialized workforce. And just to give some numbers to it, because that's the way my brain works, as of the end of April, the Roundtable, in partnership with many other different education service organizations, inquired with Americans for the Arts to see what the impact on teaching artists specifically was. And they reported that almost 5,000 respondents identified as teaching artists in that same survey I've been mentioning. And of that, 96% experienced a loss of income, 56% have become unemployed because of COVID-19, 52% have no savings now. Again, I'll note that the date of this is April 29th. With that now being 3-4 months in the past, we can only imagine that those numbers have grown. I will say, though, with these negatives, again, 83% of teaching artists say they are ready to deploy their creativity to support the recovery process. So with that in mind, the arts and culture sector and teaching artists are going to play a huge part in the recovery of schools and communities. And now more than ever, the field needs support to do so. When it comes to supporting teaching artists in particular, we at the Roundtable, in partnership with many of the other local and national arts education service organizations, encourage that you include teaching artists in conversation and decision-making processes as the arts sector is redefined, that you invest in resources like emergency funding to offer direct-to-individual support for TAs. I'll say from the Roundtable side, we're very grateful for New York Community Trust and the Booth Ferris Foundation for supporting our Arts Educators Emergency Relief Fund, which we currently have open right now, enabling us to give over $300,000 to teaching artists and arts education administered impacted by COVID-19. And unfortunately, we are seeing applications come in every 5, 10, 15 minutes. At this rate, really showing a need for this funding. Another action step would be to include teaching artists in your funding language and also examine your funding priorities. Oftentimes, it's difficult for teaching artists to fit in because they straddle both the arts and the education world. One last action step would be to ensure that the arts organizations or arts education organizations that you are funding are offering their teaching artists fair pay for their work. This has been an issue before the pandemic and has been made only worse as, like I said earlier, more time is needed to plan this digital content, and as concerns about ownership continue to grow. And lastly, what I'll say, while it's been a hard time for the arts and education community, the field is resilient. They are creative and they are driven to support their students in whatever way they can. We're seeing opportunities and potential growing each day. And in preparation for this webinar today, I asked our community, where are your areas of need and where are your areas of interest as we go into the next year? We're seeing that our community is really interested in cross-sector partnerships with film, TV, and with a particular interest in health and human services as a way they can support the recovery process and also lend a hand in the healing as we prepare to enter a school year where students and educators alike have experienced a great deal of trauma. With that in mind, I'll say organizations and teaching artists alike are interested in pedagogy. I'm sure you're hearing these buzzwords: trauma-informed best practices, social-emotional learning, culturally responsive pedagogy. A lot of this is already inherent in the arts education work, but can be difficult to illuminate that for principals or administrators. And our community is seeking to intentionally build curriculum to support our school partners and support our students in processing the trauma and the realities of the world around them. I'll say another great success of this moment has been collaboration. Our cultural community is hoping to continue with these habits of collaboration that have helped the sector to survive and thrive, hopefully moving forward. So looking for those cross collaborations within our community as well. Also looking for technology. our community is very concerned about how student access to devices and stable internet connection and making sure students have materials to be able to participate in an equitable learning experience. And lastly, I'll say just flexibility. There's so much uncertainty and things are changing by the moment here in New York City. So just the flexibility with support and funding is, as we go into the school year, is really what our organizations are seeking. And so with that, I'm going to turn things over to Bahia Ramos from the Wallace Foundation.
Thanks, Kimberly. Hi, everyone. I'm Bahia Ramos, Director of Arts at the Wallace Foundation. It's great to be here with you today, and thank you to GIA for hosting this webinar. I'm going to give a little bit of a case study, I guess, on kind of how this current environment has affected our mission of trying to provide high-quality after-school arts kind of pre- and post-pandemic, and the many adaptations we've had to employ with our partners at the Boys and Girls Club in this time. So a little bit about Wallace Foundation. We're an independent endowed foundation based here in New York City and working nationally. And our goal is to foster improvements in learning and enrichment for children, especially those from low-income households, and the vitality of the arts for everyone. In all of our work, we actually have two goals: to leave our grantees stronger and to create benefits for the broader field by developing and sharing credible, useful knowledge. And each initiative that we undertake begins with a central question that we try to answer with the help of independent research to find out what works, what doesn't, and why. So why did we choose arts education? I think there's growing evidence that arts education can help young people even beyond acquiring a specific skill. There's self-confidence that comes from mastering this new skill. It enables self-expression and a sense of agency, as you can see in this young man's sketch. And it provides role models through the lens of working with artists. And it's linked to later participation in the arts. But most importantly, the most benefits depend on the high quality of the experience and sustained engagement. We focused on after school because we thought it could help compensate for the decline of arts education in schools in general. So my theme today is about adaptation, and by that I mean a special kind of change, a change that makes a practice better suited to its environment. Adaptation, like any change, starts with something that needs to be changed. So we started with what is known about high-quality arts education, and that was boiled down to 10 principles shown here. 5 are from arts education and include professional practicing artists, high expectations, and culminating events that require self-discipline and planning. 5 are from the field of youth development and include positive relationships with adults and hands-on skill building. And we began with the question, could these 10 principles drawn from the nation's best specialty after-school arts programs be applied within a general youth-serving organization like Boys and Girls of America? Well, why Boys and Girls of America? They reached children who typically had less access to high-quality arts learning, and BGCA had the power to make access to arts education more equitable and at a volume greater than most standalone programs. So in 2014, 3 clubs in the Midwest tried it out, focusing on tweens, youth aged 10 to 14. It was a big lift, and as an evaluation team put it, to create high-quality art skill development in a setting with a drop in culture of attendance accustomed to working with limited resources. And there was no arts focus necessarily within Boys and Girls Club, though there were many arts programs being shared within the movement when we entered the system. And no one actually knew whether it would work or not. The evaluators found that some adaptation was necessary. For example, executive commitment was a principle, but at BGCA clubs with multiple layers of authority, this meant gaining commitment of not one, but several executives. And most importantly, the clubs also had to adapt. They found hiring professional teaching artists, like our friend Vidal Hill, shown here, instead of general youth workers was transformative. But the higher pay caused some tensions with other staff that had to be resolved, and artists had to adjust teaching to students with less experience in the art form who needed to be persuaded of its value. But remarkably, as an independent evaluation reported, the clubs did in fact successfully implement high-quality art skill development programs as defined by the 10 principles of success. So the success came in the engagement. So we found that youth came not only for the exposure classes, which were basically once a week open houses, but they stayed, 25% stayed for skills classes where they had the benefit of sustained engagement several times a week for 1 to 2 hours leading to a culminating event. Young people in the skills classes voted with their feet, returning at rates close to 60%. And in fact, the retention rates for young people in the Youth Arts Initiative, which are shown in the purple bar on the right, were twice that of the young people who were not in the program. And as one club staff member not involved in YAI said, the kids value YAI more than any other program, and the dedication shows. They are here all the time. They never miss a session. While we can't say that this is cause and effect, as the arts program may have drawn youth who are already especially motivated in the subject area, it still was an indication of high engagement and among an age group that typically declines in attendance at the club. So high expectations is a key feature of these 10 principles. Clubs were unsure about attendance commitment requirement and were worried whether it would deter participation. However, the program was able to institute an attendance commitment later recognized as a distinguishing characteristic. Many parents confirmed their tweens were practicing the art form and talking about their classes at home. One mother reported the program is a big deal family-wise because they bring home so much of it. We talk about it more than school. It's such a big deal, such an accomplishment. We found that young people were acquiring real skills. One young woman described creating art as the process of creating is to first imagine what you're going to draw. Then the next step is for you to sketch it out to see what it looks like. If it doesn't look right to you, then you sketch it again. Only when it looks right, that's when you start coloring it in to find out which colors you want to use. Then you paint it on a canvas. And as our evaluators concluded, high expectations and commitment did not deter tweens. They, in fact, supported deeper engagement, especially when reinforced by supportive adult mentors and strong youth development practices. So we had a proof of concept that high-quality arts learning could be carried out in a general youth-serving organization, but there was a problem. Despite the evidence of benefits, high-quality arts programming was more expensive than other programs. With each club responsible for its own fundraising, we and BGCA knew that this would be a barrier to scaling up the program and keeping it running without our funding. So could we adapt to an environment where funds were tight? In 2018, we launched a second wave in 5 cities with the goal of seeing whether the 10 principles could be adapted to a lower cost model. Planning was done in the summer and fall with a launch last spring. And these were the 5 cities in which they operated: Atlanta, Austin, Knoxville, New York, and Central Florida, which comprised Orlando. Clubs were testing out multiple strategies. For example, having several clubs share a single space within the same city, hiring assistants for teaching artists, and focusing on lower cost art forms, or using artists who brought a ready-made curriculum. And then 6 months into the program, this is what happened. COVID arrived and all things began to shut down. So how could we and BGCA adapt once more to this new environment? I will say that all of our clubs shut down, and 4 out of our 5 cities actually shut down clubs. In our 5th city, the club remained open to serve the children of essential workers during the pandemic. And I think this enabled, and we actually continued our funding of teaching artists and programs in our clubs, regardless of whether they were open or closed. And I think this resulted in, out of the many services that BGCA provided, they found that the arts had the most traction in its ability to engage and maintain youth interest. As part of the deepening investment in an arts model to serve the unit, BGCA created a new program and website called Create on July 21st. With this website came special tips on maximizing limited budgets, arts projects, and a program assessment made available to all BGCA staff, and soon will be shared with all after-school arts leaders and staff around the country. How's it going? Well, it's been early days, but remarkably, 4 of the 5 clubs have kept all their teaching artist staff, and some early lessons are emerging. While some downsides are clear, that online attention spans are shorter and hours had to be reduced in terms of service delivery, there are fewer youth joining, and the lack of broadband and technology is a problem within the communities in which they operate. There are some unexpected upsides. There are new opportunities to engage with parents who are seeing their children kind of flourish artistically by connecting with an artist each day through their club activity. Older youth have come in and provided leadership roles within the clubs and at home. And youth are reporting that they feel more emotionally safe doing work at home and interacting through technology with an artist each day and being able to express their feelings and their creativity. As part of developing a future outlook of service, BGCA analyzed 4 scenarios with the help of our program consultant. A quick snapback in the fall or early winter to in-person classes, a slow roll back to normal by spring of next year, a hybrid model with both in-person and digital, and an ongoing crisis that would force all digital programming through 2021. BGCA itself is betting on the hybrid model and taking advantage of the crisis to do something it had wanted to do for many years, combine on-site and virtual experiences. They anticipate a large share of their sites adopting a hybrid model going forward, regardless of future pandemics or societal emergencies. I think built into this model is the importance of high quality and best practice across the movement. I want to pause here and acknowledge how seismic of a shift this is for an organization that largely has a bricks and mortar approach to service delivery. I commend them for their agility in this moment and an eye towards the future of what OST arts education might look like. Summing up, we see that high quality arts learning sustained over time can yield important benefits. We can identify 10 principles behind high quality programming, and we know that general youth serving organizations can mount high quality programming, though financing is a challenge. But applying best practices in a virtual environment will require creativity and adaptation. And we need our partners to keep on learning and adapting to this world full of constraints and possibility. And we hope that we can continue to learn from the actions of our partners and help support their efforts to build this hybrid model to sustain high quality and continue to serve a large portion of our children who really need arts education the most. Thanks. Just lastly, you can find all of the information and reports on arts education on our website without charge at wallacefoundation.org. And with that, I'll turn it back over to our moderator. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all so much. Those were excellent presentations. So we are now transitioning into the Q&A portion of the presentation. Toward the bottom of your screen, you'll see the Q&A box. So please be specific about who the question is for when you are asking your question. So the first question I have will be directed to you, Kimberly. So for starters, you mentioned the Americans for the Arts survey. The participants who took the survey, were they New York City based or was it national? Was it a national audience too?
Sure. So Americans for the Arts, it was a nationally based survey. However, on a more locally centered front, our New York City Department of Cultural Affairs was very proactive in ensuring that our cultural organizations were counted. And so I would say all of the statistics I shared, with the exception of the one about teaching artists at the latter part of my presentation, was all New York City-based statistics and all about how we're currently doing here in this local environment.
Okay, great. So that's helpful. And to sort of expand things a little bit more, because I know that, of course you're New York City based, but from March until, to be continued, I know you've been doing a lot of work with other funder groups and engaging in conversations about what other people are doing. So I want to ask, what have you been seeing in terms of what cultural organizations are doing to prepare for the school year, both here in New York City and sort of other places that, from what you've been hearing?
Sure. We're largely seeing that cultural organizations are bracing for remote delivery of services from now through at least the beginning of 2021. However, we were surprised to see that we have some schools here in New York City reaching out for in-person services. With that, like I said earlier, organizations are adapting to meet the needs, while also though being transparent with their staff and surveying them as well to see what their comfort level is about reentry and with continuing to provide and deliver arts education services. On the teaching artist front, we're seeing that given the uncertainty in job prospects, teaching artists are more frequently becoming their own entrepreneurs. And so not seeking to rely just on organizations, we're seeing individual teaching artists are finding different platforms in which they can connect directly with a local community or artist. So on a national level, we're hearing about wagon arts experiences where teaching artists are literally rolling up with a wagon and bringing arts education directly to a community. We're seeing teaching artists creating their own webinars that they're offering free of charge or at a pay-what-you-can rate in order to be able to directly serve schools and communities. I would say that focus on local community organizations is also where we're seeing a lot of the community cultural interaction happening as well, given the uncertainty about what's going on with schools.
Wow, thank you. That's great. And I want to take it over to Bahia. You mentioned in your presentation that sort of the goal of the program was to have initially, before quarantine, before the pandemic started, was to have a hybrid version to offer to students. And so can you talk a little bit more about what, like sort of like the technical side, like what does Wallace think about when designing an initiative? Because none of us could have predicted where we are now, but because of the design that you'd already prepared for, you were able to transition into sort of that ultimate goal. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think we start with important questions, and we wonder whether the answer would matter to the field at all if there's interest in solving that question. And we've done some background study on high performing arts education models to see what are the common qualities across these programs, and can those principles so much be like lifted and placed into any space regardless of environment. And I think the impetus for BGCA was really thinking about how can we serve as many children as possible through this movement by employing the principles in that environment, and can the principles be adapted for that environment. And I would say like the residual effect is, is every kid now going to become an artist? No. But is there a notion of like high quality, and the notion that like arts education provides and supplies a high quality interaction for the children coming into the club, and it's something that gets sustained and built over time. And the notion of high quality had a real impact on the way BGCA thought about their own service delivery and community. And so that when they transitioned to digital, they had to employ these creative tactics around high quality, around kind of arts engagement and cultural engagement with the community ecosystem at large. And I think that's the kind of greater impact of coming into a system with arts education as the focus, and kind of really underlying the principles and making them transparent and clear for those who want to implement different strategies around the goal of providing arts education to community.
Great. Thank you. For you, Alex, so you went over quite a bit at the beginning of the presentation. But specifically, is there any discussion around providing flexibility for existing funding streams for arts education? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so first, all of this COVID-related relief, whether it be under the CARES Act or in future acts, is likely to be pretty much up to school districts about how to spend within the broad sphere of it has to be somewhat COVID-related, right? Like I don't think Congress is looking to do things that aren't. But to the extent you need to bring a program online or get materials to allow it to work in a virtual environment or a hybrid environment, those would certainly be justified and allowable uses of this sort of aid and more than likely future aid. So that would certainly include any sort of arts-related offering, right, including about how to redesign a room or provide a certain curriculum or an app or something like that that allows you to do those sort of things. I think the other side to that coin is that while Congress is looking at providing additional aid for these things, they're also looking to make program funding more flexible in general to allow school districts to be able to adapt to situations. One thing that the Department of Education is allowing is the ability to apply for waivers of what we call the kind of different buckets of funding that are allowable under something called the Title IV of ESEA program. Essentially, it's a student support and academic enrichment grant program that it's probably the main funder of arts-related kind of programming under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, same law that includes Title I. They are allowing waivers for school districts to seek waivers of the percentage of funding they have to spend on well-rounded education, which also includes the arts. So you could spend more on technology or more on school safety or less on well-rounded or more on well-rounded, depending on what you want to do. You know, that could have some impact on how much is spent on arts education as a whole through the federal dollars that are out there.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I think that continues to make the case for more sort of like intersectional programs, projects that folks can get more involved with. So thank you for that. And I want to kick it back over to you, Kim. This is a New York City specific question, but it can be applied more broadly, just kind of depending on what folks are seeing in their various cities. So the person asks, what have you heard so far from principals about whether they intend to continue offering virtual or hybrid arts instruction during school hours? Are they talking about nurturing SEL through the arts? I'm concerned about losing certified arts teaching staff as well as partnerships due to the New York City Department of Education budget cuts.
Sure. So I'll admit we aren't hearing a whole lot from principals. What we do know at this time is that while here in New York City, what's the Office of Arts and Special Projects is not able to provide funding for arts partnerships, the principals really are the financial leaders of their schools and control school budgets. So principals with a specific interest may be able to allocate funding for arts partnerships as they have previously. When it comes to social emotional learning and arts teaching staff, again, it really varies on the individual principals. We're seeing as arts organizations are reaching out to their school partners, both longtime partners and partnerships on the newer side, that there are principals that are interested in engaging and see the value of social emotional learning, but it's really coming down to the individual principal being the advocate to have those programs in their schools. And when it comes to arts teaching staff, again, it varies from school to school. Some arts teaching staff does not know how they will be teaching arts. With our first school day in New York City going to be at the beginning of September 10th, there's still question and uncertainty about what that will look like. But really it's falling on the principals we're seeing and how invested they are personally in ensuring that their students receive an arts education, an equitable arts education experience.
And I think that's fair. So many people are waiting and won't really find out until maybe a few days before school starts, and everyone's trying to figure it out and making decisions in real time once school starts as well to support students in the best way possible. So I will kick it over to you, Bahia, and someone asked a question specific to rural arts, and they asked, I'd like to hear about encouraging rural arts organizations to connect with high-quality teaching artists or training their arts educators to become high-quality teachers. That question is for you.
I mean, I think first we have a report called Something to Say that's on our website that kind of goes into the background of these principles behind arts, high-quality arts education that I definitely suggest taking a look at, and along with some case studies around BGCA and our evaluation reports from the first round of experiments that we had that can give you a taste of what the results have been in places like Milwaukee and different cities in Wisconsin and in Minnesota around the work that we've done. And I think it's a good primer for testing out, how do these qualities fit with the goals that one might have for their program. And I think as we look to, what we're trying to do right now actually is think about what is this marriage of high quality arts and the virtual experience. What might that look like, and how do we learn best practices from that kind of environment? Because the signal is that whether we go back to 100% in-person programs or not, like this will be the new norm going forward, and communities and organizations need to be able to have the best practices at hand to adapt to those models. And so we're trying to dig underneath the surface of what's happening now and kind of revamp our own perspective on how high-quality arts education is delivered in any community, actually, through our work.
Great, thank you. Okay, Alex, are you with us?
I'm still here, yes.
Okay, good. I wasn't sure who dropped off. All right, so this next question is actually for you, and it's
Sure.
Spirit of community-based organizations. So this person asked, arts education in many of our cities is being provided by community-based organizations that employ teaching artists, rather than public and schools. So what are the prospects for federal funding to be provided in these community-based institutions?
So, I mean, a lot of the education money that folks are talking about really would go through school districts, right, or state educational agencies to schools. Primarily, I think there's really one route, really. I don't think you see separate resources for arts education outside of that context of schools. I think what you're more likely to see is ways that people continue to look at how to support nonprofits. One obvious way that I mentioned in my presentation was the Paycheck Protection Program, to ensure that nonprofits had resources there to continue to support employee salaries that are on payroll. Obviously, if you're a 1099er, right, and you're providing work in concert with a nonprofit, you probably don't benefit from that directly. Obviously, fiscal help for a community-based organization in general that might help them stave off other cuts in other areas. But this is one of the real challenges, I think, in that, the primary way the federal government has looked to support nonprofits is through this Paycheck Protection Program and some other pandemic loan-based programs, but there isn't general assistance per se to nonprofits, certainly including community-based organizations that are focused on the arts in any way. I think that's why you've seen things come up like the charitable deduction, $300 above the line. I'm not saying that should be viewed as a Band-Aid that fixes all problems there. But the nonprofit kind of impact, I think, has yet to be fully explored even by Congress, and may not be, as people are running around to deal with UI and politics and the election and things like that. So I don't see the next bill having dedicated funds, per se, for nonprofits that aren't already in the mix, like the Paycheck Protection Program.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's helpful. Thank you for going into that. I'm going to ask one more question from one of our guests that is directed to all three of you. And this person asks, what kind of funding streams should we immediately focus on? There are organizations that are ready to offer free, high-quality virtual arts education.
Well, I mean, one thing I think that I would always say, this is Alex, but just to go back on kind of what you were just saying is that, I mean, I think partnerships with the schools right now as they're looking to make sure that, kids still have access and opportunity to, a pretty vibrant and diverse education. You can imagine if a lot of the arts was provided in a very bricks and mortar sort of world, and schools are struggling to still get their math and English and science and social studies sort of stuff online. I think it's a definite plus to look at how you partner with schools. In addition to obviously, looking at what other community actors are out there that can supplement those offerings in the ways they always would. But kids are still going to be involved in school in some fashion, and that's a great place to get a lot of kids out there. So that's just my thought.
Good. Thank you. Kimberly or Bahia, did you want to comment?
Yeah, this is Bahia. I would definitely second Alex's point about that if we're talking about immediately available funds, and also as if they are artists, the fund that Kimberly mentioned earlier, fund for teaching artists that are working in partnership with different programs if we're speaking about readily, immediately available funding for folks who'd like to get programs off the ground.
Yeah, this is Kim. I'll echo that as well. Emergency relief funding for arts educators, specifically teaching artists, is where we're seeing the biggest need, and access to being able to fund those already established relief funds at this time. But also in terms of being able to provide free programming, a plug for our membership. I know our community here in New York City has been actively working to provide free programming for New York City students and communities, and are definitely seeking support on continuing that work, given how public funding has been so severely impacted.
Yeah, that's great. All right, everyone. Well, we have come to the end of our presentation. I want to thank our presenters again, Alex, Kimberly, Bahia. Thank you so much for sharing. We've posted their emails if you have further questions. And today's presentation has been recorded, so we'll be sending you a link to the recording file and the presentation slides in the next few days. We also invite you to take a brief survey that we'll share immediately following the survey, because we want to know what you thought, so please do take the survey. And we hope that you will continue to visit our website and keep the conversation going on how we can reimagine the future of philanthropy in this very interesting time while keeping racial equity at the center. If you have further questions, feel free to reach out to me, Sherilyn Seeley, and thank you again for joining us. Have a great day, everyone.